My name is Niraja Gopal and I teach at the Center for the Study of Law and Governance at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. It's diversity plus. Diversity describes something, a situation in which there are multiple groups living together or multiple anythings cohabiting. Plurality, the word plurality in my view signifies something quite similar to diversity in that it describes a social fact. Whereas pluralism is an approach towards, I think, how we view, how we value, how we think about diversity or plurality, which are simply descriptors. So pluralism to that extent, I think, has a prescriptive element as well. It has a normative element. It's a value which looks positively at diversity and plurality and seeks to foster these in an attitude or an approach. It's a bunch of things. You might have a very progressive, inclusive, constitutional and legal framework, but then you might have in the same society deep inequalities which make the equal citizenship promised by that constitution or by that legal framework or that policy framework render them sort of fragile and perhaps unequal to the task of actually ensuring that citizens are in practice truly equal. So when you have those sorts of deep inequalities, and particularly when economic inequalities mirror and reproduce ethnic inequalities, that's when the trouble starts. And I think that is when you can have a shift away from pluralism, or that is when you have to recognize that even the best constitutional architecture cannot actually change things on the ground simply because existing entrenched inequalities will not let it happen. So the best laws and the most progressive constitutions in the world can't necessarily, simply by providing for equal citizenship, ensure equal citizenship. So, and in an ideal world, the best thing would be to have a great constitutional and legal framework that is robust, that guarantees equal citizenship, that makes exceptions, special exceptions or special provisions which may depart from the principle of equality to give something extra to those who need a leg up in society, such as groups which have been historically disadvantaged. In my country, there are the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, for whom the political nomenclature is Dalits and Adivasis. And for these groups, the Constitution makes special provision in the form of what in this part of the world is called affirmative action. We call it positive discrimination. So that little extra is supposed to give a leg up, or at least make it possible for there to be some equality at the starting line. But once again, because there is this sort of parallel and overlapping inequalities in the economic sphere on the one hand and the cultural or symbolic on the other, you often don't actually get that outcome despite the best intentions, despite the most progressive constitutional architecture. So I think it's a combination of factors. In an ideal world, everyone should be equal. Everyone should have equal access to employment, to education, to the conditions of meaningful citizenship. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world. The greatest obstacles, I think, are first and foremost majoritarian policies, policies that exclude. If that's a no-starter. If you're starting from a position of inequality that is sanctified by the law, that's the worst possible starting point for a plural society. You cannot have a plural society in which inequality is built into the law. So laws and policies must be neutral, at least neutral. But it's not enough for them to be neutral or promoting justice and so on. then you also need material equality, or at least you need to reduce and diminish inequalities, material inequalities, to be able to get beyond. Another danger, and this is where, in a sense, many good values come into conflict with each other. So, for instance, pluralism is a great value, and many of us would swear by it. But then there's also other values which are equally good, equally attractive, equally desirable, but they conflict with the value of pluralism. For instance, justice, social justice. So in my part of the world, groups which have been historically disadvantaged and left out, completely left out of the decision-making processes, would tend to mobilize politically as well to be able to have their voices heard. But there are also other groups which are not so marginalized, but which invent traditions of victimhood or narratives of victimhood for their own histories. Some of these can be invented traditions, and then mobilize on the basis of those. So that makes democracy susceptible to forms of ethnic capture, or particular groups holding democracy in a sense to ransom on the basis of invented identities. And when that happens, it's very hard then to tell the good from the bad. It's very hard then to say when the truly marginalized, disempowered, disenfranchised groups are actually benefiting from democracy, and when democracy is being cynically appropriated by groups that are simply inventing victimhood narratives. Absolutely. In fact, one of the founders of our Constitution who presided over the drafting committee was the leader of the Dalits, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and he had sort of, at the end of the Constituent Assembly's deliberations in November 1949, made the statement that it was all very well to have political democracy, but until the time we had social and economic democracy, he said, the task was not just incomplete, but it was also possible that political democracy itself would explode in the presence of social and economic inequalities if these were left unaddressed by policy. Yeah. Some people would argue they have been left substantially unaddressed. In the countries of the Global South, at least those which are democracies, it is frequently argued that because the state is in a position of command, the state commands huge resources, this makes the state itself a prize that competing political groups seek to capture. And there's a lot of truth in this. Because the state controls resources, the state becomes the object of attraction for political groups, which then mobilize in order to control it. The question is that doesn't end there, because if particular groups have captured state power because of the resources that are attached to it, there is a perverse incentive to use those resources for your own constituents, especially if they are ethnically narrowly defined, than to use them for the common good at large. So there's a real conundrum here. There's a conflict in the sense that if we are, let's say, advocates of a welfare state, and we want the state to provide welfare benefits for the entire population, we want the state to be in command and to be running or at least propelling the agenda for redistribution, right? But that renders the state vulnerable to capture and then possibly the channeling of welfare benefits to particular groups or to none at all. There's rent seeking, there's the appropriation of public good for private gain, all the sort of standard narratives of corruption that many countries have experienced. But if, on the other hand, you say the state should therefore control less resources so that it becomes less attractive to political competition, to groups that are in political competition with each other, that's not the best solution either, because there's no guarantee at all that the interests of the vast majority will be taken care of. So it's a genuine problem. I think on the whole, on balance, it makes sense for the state to control societal resources, the social product, so to speak, and to be able to direct it in ways that actually benefit the larger population rather than simply particular segments of it. But that's the price you pay for democracy. You know, unless you have citizens who are well educated, well fed, healthy, and part of the productive workforce, aware enough of societal problems and issues to be able to vote into power governments that will actually serve the common good. And that is an ideal situation, but it's not something that we find every day. Yeah. That particular impact may not only be the result of corruption. So you can have clientelist politics, which is not necessarily corrupt politics. It just, it can be underpinned by the claim that, well, these are the disadvantaged groups in society. Benefits need to be channeled to these groups. They need disproportionately more as compared to everyone else. And you can do that in a corruption-free way. It's just that you will not be attending to the welfare of all. So it's possible to be sort of sectarian within quotes in your approach without actually being corrupt. The corruption issue, however, is something that needs to be tackled through greater accountability initiatives and governance reform in the direction of transparency. And there are lots of movements. In my own country, there was a very successful movement for the right to information, which resulted in a progressive law in 2005 called the Right to Information Act, and that has made a little bit of a difference already. We do recognize, however, that the Act is actually used quite a lot by people who are not necessarily using it, for the larger common good, but and we would like to see more poor people using it in the case of the non-delivery of public services and so on, but gradually with greater awareness and civil society mobilization and so on, that is beginning to happen.